term I came up with really guided me through it, and what I think that whoever wrote Pretty Sarah was doing. It's emotional landscaping. He doesn't need to go down to a lone hollow, but he wants, before he tells us his story, he wants to put us into a physical place where we can feel the way he feels. Down in some lone hollow, but it's not completely quiet. There's a turbulence to his story too. So there are birds making noises, and the noise increases. So there's the wildness and the loneliness at the same time. And when you're there, then he wants to tell you this quiet, desolate, turbulent story about this love that, I mean, one of the most pathetic lines in a sad love song you've ever heard. I mean, pathetic in a wonderful way. My love, she won't have me, and I understand. Oh, man, you're killing me. Stop. You know, I feel a little pissed off. But it's because this really ultimately underneath it all, this is a song like so many of these love songs from the lower classes back when the class structure defined everything about our lives. It's about class. He is of a lower class, and he can never hope to be able to give her what she can give. And at that time, being the choice a woman made of who she married was not only the most important decision, in a very real way, it was the only decision she ever made in her life. You know, like the old song says, hard is the fortune of all womankind, always controlled, always confined, slave to her parents until she is wed, slave to her husband until she is dead. And so that decision, this woman making that decision, you get the sense she probably loves him too, but this guy's got a house. And come February, that's going to be important to him, you know. So then he, at the end of the song, he wants to take us down to this, again, this very lonely place, down by this river, but it's a roaring river, it's a rushing river, because he wants us to feel both the desolation, the sadness, but also the turbulence of it all. And that really guided me in two ways that I think were really important for using description. One, I tried always to make the description part of the story, rather than a departure from it. Now, I got to say, a lot of very successful novelists don't do that. You know, they set up a scene, they introduce you to, Robert Parker does this all the time in the Spencer novels. He'll introduce you to somebody, and then he'll spend a couple of paragraphs describing exactly what the person looks like in ways that I don't think tell you a lot about who he is necessarily, and that may not end up being important at all because it's just somebody he's interrogating on his, but he does it, and you know, you get okay. He sold some books. He moved some units. So, but for me, because I was, in so many ways I was thinking of revival as its own piece of music, its own song. I wanted it all to be part of a story. I wanted always to be telling a story and not to depart from that story. And I'll give you some examples of how I use that I put together just for you because I knew I was going to be in a room full of writers. So, you know, this book is not entirely about folk music. As you can tell, it's also about these very human issues that confront these two people. The younger character, not only her inability to get through a song on stage and this terrible problem she has being who she's capable of being, which I think is a very central problem for all of us in our 20s, just whether it's stage fright or whatever, we are in our heads and our hearts such better people than we're able to show the world until we figure out how to get control of it all. But she also, I think, and this is the thing that I admired about her the most in writing Kit Palmer, was she has this fierce ambition and this equally fierce desire for that ambition not to be self-serving, for it to be used as the fuel to create a life of purpose and of value and of community. And I think it's one of the first things that attracts her to Nathan is that, you know, here's a guy who knows all the secrets she needs to know, and here is a guy who needs a lot of work, not a help. Anyway, Nathan, at a very dangerous point in the book, slips back into this depression, this chronic depression that he's been so comfortable living in. And I wanted to, if any of you have had problems with periodic depression and this kind of depression, and I certainly have it, People write about it as a state of mind, and they write about it in a cause and effect way. But I wanted to write about it very physically, because I think one of the things that people miss about this kind of chronic depression is how seductive it is, how good it feels. And there's a reason people look for reasons to slip back into it. And it, like Nathan even refers to it as his old gray mistress. And as he slips back into it, let me show you how I do it in degrees, but also how I use, it's a nor'easter that brings it up. He awoke the next morning in a warm, woolly funk, which he looked forward to indulging. Just a brood, he thought, a fine wintry brood. He made tea, not coffee. Don't want to get too perky, spoil the exquisite grayness. While the water boiled, he looked outside. Wet smacks of snow still clung to the windows and lined the frames like creamy icing. The yard was high with snow, well over a foot, piling toward the far fence, like it was trying to climb over. It remained cloudy with occasional fierce gusts that blew the snow as if it was still falling. It was white everywhere except for the granite gray of the sky, the walls of the grand old houses down the street, and the stark black of the bare trees. He got his tea and, softly blowing on it, returned to the window. The snow was piled on the panes, always more to the left than the right. He wondered why. Taking his first sip of hot tea, he looked into the yard at the big oak in the sloping yard and beyond to the back fence. The branches on the farther trees looked hazy, almost blurry in the drifting air, but the big oak, the nearest tree, seemed sharply in focus. The effect was like a photograph with the background in soft focus, leading the eye to the foreground. So Nathan looked back at the big oak. The branches seemed lower today, sagging under the weight of the snow. Maybe they just looked that way because only the bottoms of the branches showed under the snow. That's a strong old tree, he thought, nodding and sipping his tea. It's used to wearing a little snow. He saw one small bird on a high branch, huddled close into himself, head darting this way and that. Nowhere else to go. Nowhere warmer, safer, happier. Boy, he knew that feeling, didn't he? The storm is everywhere. The same miserable chill. So there's no sense moving. There's nowhere warmer, safer, happier. Just hunker down, crawl into yourself, wait it out, wait it out, wait it out. You see him just kind of slipping into it and letting himself fall into it. And let me do another little passage and then show him kind of snapping out of it. A little after 2 in the morning, with the storm still slapping hard against the windows and walls, he took a hot bath, now listening to the droning 16th century choral music of Giovanni Palestrina. All about God, at least that's what the lyrics say, but so sad, full of knowable human yearning and the long fear that is always there. He unfurled his old comforter, and turned the thermostat down. The chillier the apartment was, the more acutely he felt the captured heat within his baggy clothes. He put Palestrina on so low that it felt more like he was remembering it than hearing it, and went to bed. He slept like he was dead. He awoke heavily. The comforter, full of his own heat, drowned him with a delicious lethargy. Overnight his solitude had deepened. As he slowly got out of bed, the aloneness filled him, made his ears seem clotted and his eyes cloudy, as if all his senses had thickened and slowed, like almost frozen water. It felt like there was a coat of down inside his head, blanketing his brain with an almost liquid warmth. It was delightful, sensuous, and he knew, deep down, it was dangerous. And that's when he started avoiding Kit. And then just this one other little passage to show him kind of snapping out. But do you see what I'm talking about? About how I wanted to show how it's seducing him and he's seducing it, but also using the landscape and the music to create a physical sense of emotional landscape where he is. So I wasn't thinking about, I was really thinking about the reader through all of that. To put him, I wanted the reader to be deep inside Nathan for this. to be feeling what he's feeling and seeing what he's seeing. And I saw through Pretty Sarrow how landscape can be used because it evokes all of our memories. It puts us all in a common place to help us do that. Anyway, by Sunday, Nathan knew he was in trouble. He thought about all the years he had spent this way, not just alone, but dug in, entrenched in his aloneness. You don't realize how passive you get. You just start whittling away at your life. You tell yourself you're prioritizing. You don't need this, don't need that. But how can you prioritize when nothing seems important? Because life is no longer something you're doing. It's something that's happening to you. A storm hitting you from all sides. What can you do? People, places, things, events, they have nothing to do with you. And you have nothing to do with them. It's the little details you start to ignore first, the everyday things. And you say you're focusing on the necessary things, but you're not getting to them either. This errand can wait until tomorrow. You don't need to do that chore right now. Instead, you look out the window and ponder how little you have to do with anything in your life. The storm is everywhere. There's no sense moving, nowhere safer, warmer, happier. Hunker down, wait it out, wait it out, wait it out. Nathan looked out the window, remembering what it was like back then when nothing seemed like it was worth doing. God, but I was deep in, he whispered, and got up to make some coffee. He returned to the window, sipping his coffee, and for some reason remembered the day several years ago when he first went out to buy a plant. Something alive in the house, he thought. He couldn't even conceive of it as something else alive in the house. Not yet. But it was a first swing of the hammer against the great gray wall he'd built around himself, and it let in a small but crucial shard of light. Had he known that at the time? No. Well, maybe a little, dimly. Now he saw it with such clarity, his first convincing blow against the comforting dark. Those weak early blows accomplish so much more than they seem to at the time. They are the mortal wounds to the darkness you are fighting your way out of. The rest simply widen the crack through which your life can pour back in. Those first blows win the war. Only battles follow. So let me do another song, and then I'll do one more true story for you. If anybody has anything to say, questions? As long as we were talking about Dylan, I'll do it. This is another example of those emotional landscapes. This is one of my favorite Dylan songs, maybe because I grew up in Minnesota. So I know whereof he is singing. That was the first thing. I grew up in Minnesota, so the first thing I had trouble with Dylan with when I heard his voice is I can still remember looking at the record that my friend, who was a big Dylan freak, looked at. I mean, I loved his songs, but I'd never heard him sing. And I heard him, and I listened to about a couple verses, and I said, I thought you said he was from Hibbing. That's not how people from Hibbing talk. Like, they don't talk like this in Hibbing, Minnesota. But then I thought, the whole history of folk music might be very different if in the early 60s a young scruffy-faced lad had clambered on the stage of the smoky Bleecker Street coffee house and begun singing, "Well, how many rods must a man walk down, eh?" They might have just thought he was lost, If you're traveling to the North Country Fair, where the winds hit heavy on the borderline, remember me, the one who's there. She once was a true love of mine. Sorry. If you're traveling to the snowflake storm, where the rivers freeze and summer ends, please see she has a coat so warm. Keep her from the howling. See for me if her hair's on her breast. They say for me with her hair's hanging long. That's the way I remember her the best. Is the time I've often prayed in the darkness of my night, in the brightness of my day. So if you're traveling to the North Country Fair, where the winds hit heavy on the borderline, remember me. Once was a true love. She once was a true love. She once was a true love. Surprising coming from him, he would say something that's egalitarian, but he said once, I've never thought there was such a thing as a bad song, just different kinds of good ones. But let me do another of these true stories here, and then just throw it open to anything you folks want or have to say. My favorite quote about writing, this was so useful to me at the Globe.
Well, you gave it away where you worked.
Huh?
You just gave it away where you worked.
Oh, no, did I not say that?
No, no, you didn't before.
Oh, I didn't, yeah, I was the folk critic for the Boston Globe for many years. Yeah, that's what I meant about don't get me started on. It was such a great paper when I was privileged to write for it. Dorothy Parker said, of writing, she said, to write is not good. To have written is good. This, if I had to pick one all-time favorite true story about folk music, this would be it. Probably won't surprise you. Fame is a funny duck in the folk world. Folks' notion of fame has always been both larger and smaller than the kind of fame pop culture celebrates. Nathan wanted to explore that because it showed some essential demarcation points between folk and the mainstream music industry. He knew a couple of stories that fit the bill. In the 1970s, Pete Seeger was invited to sing in Barcelona, Spain. Francisco Franco's fascist government, the last of the dictatorships that started World War II, was still in power, but declining. A pro-democracy movement was gaining strength, and to prove it, they invited America's best-known Freedom Center to Spain. More than 100,000 people were in the stadium, where rock bands had played all day, but the crowd had come for Seeger. As Pete prepared to go on, government officials handed him a list of songs he was not allowed to sing. Pete studied it mournfully, saying it looked an awful lot like his set list. But they insisted he must not sing any of these songs. Pete took the government's list of banned songs and strolled on stage. He held up the paper and said, "I've been told that I'm not allowed to sing these songs." He grinned at the crowd and said, "So I'll just play the chords. Maybe you know the words." They didn't say anything about you singing. He strummed his banjo to one song after another, and they all sang. 100,000 defiant freedom singers breaking the law with Pete Seeger, filling the stadium with words their government did not want them to hear, words they all knew. and had sung together in secret circles for years. What could the government do? Arrest 100,000 singers? It had been beaten by a few banjo chords and the fame of a man whose songs were on the lips of the whole world. Folk is thought of as a fringe music, but what rock star has that kind of fame? Which of the world's great pop stars could have done what Pete Seeger did, knowing that 100,000 people from another country, speaking another language, would know the words to the songs he came to sing for them, and that they would rise and do it in defiance of their government? That is fame.
That is true. That's true.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
True, I heard it from his grandson.
Yeah.
His grandson Tao told, it's one of the ones they told me at the end of an interview. And he said there are all these amazing things that Grandpa's done that nobody knows about because he can't figure out how to tell the story in a way that doesn't make him the star of the story. And he doesn't want to be the star of the story. He wants us to be the star of the story. So he just doesn't tell us about this. Does anybody have any questions or anything you want to say?
Did you grow up in a musical family?
Yes. My mother was a very good piano player. Both my grandmother and one of my aunts were professional concert pianists. I never heard them play professionally, but and my mother, you know how whatever is going on in your family, you don't think it's odd or unusual. You think whatever's happening in your family is just normal. My mother actually sang folk songs. She had an old guitar that she'd learned how to play in college, and she'd been to a ranch in Montana when she was a little girl and learned some cowboy songs from some of the last of the real cowboys. And on very special nights she would pull out the guitar and she would sing mostly Anglo-Scottish ballads and cowboy songs, and which still form the core of my repertoire. So that was, yeah,
That's great.
believe me, inspiring me to become a folk singer was not what she had in mind. And another thing they did, she had Pete Seeger's albums, America's Best Loved Ballads. It was a series he did for Folkways in the 50s when he was convicted of contempt of Congress for refusing to cooperate with the House Un-American Activities Committee. Talk about a man ahead of his time. Contempt of Congress. You couldn't find a jury today. But he was a felon through all of the 50s. And you know, the Weavers were the most popular, his group, the Weavers, was the most popular vocal group in the world. They were the Beatles of 1949, 1950, 1951, until they were blacklisted. So you can really, the commercial folk revival really began in the late 40s, and then was crushed by the blacklist, by Joe McCarthy, and then reemerged with another generation who were old enough not to have those Great Depression connections with leftist groups that ruined the careers of so many people. So bands like the Kingston Trio and Peter, Paul, and Mary came up that were untouchable because of those associations, the lack of those associations, and they started singing the Weavers songs at that time. So many of the songs, even Kumbaya, that we think of as 60 songs, were really first popularized by the Weavers in 1949, 1950. Of course, Pete wrote Where Have All the Flowers Gone, he wrote If I Had a Hammer. But anyway, I had these albums, my mother had these albums, and when my dad he was in advertising, when he'd bring people over to entertain, one of the ways that they would bribe me to stay in my room is they would give me a big bag of candy. They'd let me go up to the corner store and get a big bag of candy, and then they'd let me have the Pete Seeger records in my room, and I could play them on my little stereo. So, I mean, at some point, I mean, what did they expect? You know, they leave me all alone with Pete Seeger and 3 pounds of sugar. What did they think was going to happen? But what I didn't realize until I was an adult, it suddenly one night when I was remembering that, it struck me that they needed to get those records out of the record collection because my dad was having clients over for dinner. So he couldn't have the Pete Seeger records in the record collection. So they were killing 2 birds with 1 stone, getting me to stay in my room and getting the Pete Seeger stuff out of the record collection. So even more, you know. They put me in that room with this outlaw music and sugar. I've never been the same. From the first time, I haven't been fit for useful work since. Anybody else? Any other questions?
Have you read Woody Guthrie's novel, attempted a novel?
No. Is it out now?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know it was out.
Came out about 3-4 weeks ago.
Yeah. Have you read it?
House of Earth. I tried.
Not very good?
I couldn't get into it. It's a long Dust Bowl talking blues.
Oh,
I mean, it just goes on and on
Yeah.
and on.
yeah.
And,
That's what he did.
but so it doesn't have the brevity and clarity you were referring to earlier.
Yeah.
But it does have the sense of place. I mean, it's
Yeah.
like,
Yeah. Well, you've read Bound for Glory.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Bound for Glory is written that way too. I mean, it's just
a wonderful book.
his musicality, his genius with words is just for interested in the musicality of prose, I'd really recommend Bound for Glory, which is very much storytelling. It's very tight, vivid prose, but it's got that musicality.
Yeah, this is not tight, but it's vivid but not tight.
Yeah, yeah.
There's a connection to Bound for Glory and this Writers' Center and Charles Olson. Do you know that story?
No,
Charles Olson met Pete at Harvard. Pete was doing tables, and Olson was a fellow there.
He was studying journalism. He
Yeah.
always told me that in his
Yeah.
interviews.
And he met Olson, and they got along. And then a couple years later, he was walking in the village, and he saw this huge guy, and knew that it was Charles Olson, and invited him to come over to the house there
Mm-hmm.
to have dinner.
Yeah.
And I think it was 48. And Woody Guthrie was there.
Mm-hmm.
And Olson and Guthrie got it on and spent a good deal of time talking. And Charles asked him what he was, what he said that he should write down this story, what he was telling him, and that he was working at a small magazine called The Progressive, and that he'd get it published. And that's what Woody did. He got it to Charles Olson. It was published, and that's when the guy at Knopf, for one of those big publishing houses, saw it, and that became Bound for Glory. Yeah. So that was a connection with Olson here in Gloucester, and this place here, it was Vincent Farini's house, but it's the Writers' Center is sort of dedicated to the poetic investigation that both those guys spent time with.
Well, one of the things Nathan says in Ponders and Revival, I actually have it on one of the bookmarks, is it may be a big world, but folk music is a small town. Did you?
I was going to ask you about the similarity of songwriting to writing a novel, because the way you talk about Kit and Nathan writing songs felt like a lot of descriptions of how people write fiction.
Yeah. Well, I found songwriting really useful in, just like studying the traditional songs, in things like landscape and physical descriptions. And in a song, you're so limited that you have to, there has to be a purpose, but it's not always a literal purpose. I mean, if Dylan's going to have a snowflake storm in a song, there's got to be a reason for it. And even if it's a reason that's felt more than, I think that's probably where songwriting helped me the most, in realizing that fiction, like music, was an emotional language as much as a literal language. And it really helped me understand how to write emotionally in ways that wouldn't be particularly welcomed at the copy desk of the Globe, 5 p.m. at deadline time.
is it more like poetry? I mean,
Yeah, well, yeah. Well, songwriting certainly is.
Yeah.
But I think another thing, and I don't know, some people notice this, others don't, and it's not important that you notice it, but I certainly notice it. There is to me a real melody to the prose. There's a real musicality. I don't know if you could sense it in the readings I was doing, but I was very aware, for example, of the musical feel of cowboy music when I wrote that passage about Colorado Trail. I don't want people necessarily to hear Colorado Trail, but I think most people will imagine at least the mood and timbre of a cowboy song as they're reading that passage. Let's see how I start the passage with the easy gait of the cowboy. You could almost hear the slow padding of yeah. And I'm very mindful of, and not in a manipulative way. I mean, I never counted it off like blank verse or anything, but I was aware of the musicality of it. I think I've always tried to be a musical writer that way, that prose, I've always loved the rhythm of the English language. To me, it's a very musical language. And I've always, it's one of the things that draws me to ballads, to songs that tell stories, because they have that in it. But I think songwriting very much helped me with that, and with knowing how to write about the emotions and how to surround the reader with things that will pull them into their own memory instead of, another place I depart from a lot of modern fiction writers is that I don't want you to see my picture of Nathan's backyard. I want you to see your picture of it. And I don't want, I think a lot of modern novelists, they feel like their job is to absolutely transmit their photograph of what they're describing to you. They want you to see exactly what they're seeing. And I don't. I want to get you close enough that you'll, and this is the musician in me, that your memory will kick in. And that's another one of the things I really learned from traditional poetry, that, you think about the songs that are the most visual. You think about, how little description there was in Pretty Sarah, but how incredibly vivid and transporting it was, because they just give you enough. Down in some lone hollow where the wild birds sing, you could do the rest. You know what a lone hollow looks like. You know what a rushing river looks like. And I think one of the reasons that those songs have such power is that there's such a simplicity and a universality to the imagery, and then they let you do the rest. That was a big part of Woody's genius, I think, is that you wrote the songs with him when you were singing.
Can you sing one?
Yeah, I will, sure.
When you're writing a relationship, a love relationship between two people who are feeling mutually the same way, no matter what is happening between them, how do you avoid redundancy in the picture throughout?
Say that again.
I'm not expressing myself right.
Be redundant with that, because I didn't quite follow it.
When there are two people that have this really compelling draw toward each other, no matter what's happening in their relationship, you know what I mean? Like, that's when he started avoiding Kit and blah, 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 blah. It isn't because he doesn't love her, it's because of what's going on.
Yeah.
Just in the color of the language, how do you avoid redundancy in the language about how they feel about each other?
I see, yeah.
Am I making myself clear?
Absolutely, yeah, and I think especially with love, it is a great question.
Because it can become really sort of, oh, okay, yeah, we know they love each other by now.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
I think that I think there's three little points. One, that's the perfect example of where the writer's axiom, show don't tell, comes in. You don't talk about how much they love each other and how much they feel for each other. You show them, and not show them whispering sweet nothings, but just show the compatibility in the affection and how they talk to each other and how they are around each other. There's one there's several passages where Nathan marvels at how comfortable he is being quiet with her, and that he's never felt that way around a woman before. A big part of what is happening with Nathan is he's been alone for years, so he's falling in love again as a very different human being than he was the last time. But it's a matter of showing and not telling. Another thing is, this is something that the folk songs taught me, and it's something that I think we have a lot of trouble with in literature and in art and just in our lives today, and that is, there's nothing more daring than being willing to risk corniness. You know, being just open displays of emotion, and to risk being obvious about that and being corny about that, because that's how real people are around each other. And that leads to the third thing, which helped me a lot through the book. I read, I did some writing about Robert Burns, and I really, really recommend his letters to anybody who wants to learn how to write, because he gets into these wonderful arguments with his publishers who want him to be the poet that he was when he's transformed himself into a folk songwriter, which is always what he wanted to be. So he argues forcefully about the difference between a lyric and a poem, and at the same time attacks the kind of presumptuousness and pretension of that kind of Edwardian poetry. That it was Edwardian when he was going on, wasn't it? Oh, before Edwardian, in the 1780s. But and one of the things he said that was really just, I'd like it carved in granite somewhere. He said, originality is a coy feature in composition. Love the use of the word coy. And then the example he gives is, we poetical folk, for instance, have been writing about the spring for centuries. But as the spring occurs the same, a certain repetition in phrasing is inevitable. And in other words, don't try to say something about the spring that nobody's said before. Don't try to write about a spring that nobody's ever experienced before. Don't be afraid to write about the things that really excite you about spring, which are corny things. You know, and don't be afraid of being cute, because that's part of the way we are. We become childlike when we're feeling our emotions in an unfiltered way. And don't be afraid of cliche, you know, as long as you're saying it in your own words, because the spring has been occurring the same for centuries. And if you want somebody to climb inside your writing and feel spring, the more you try to be original about it, the likelier you are to push them away, because they know everything that you know about spring.
Reminds me of something else you said. Picasso said, who should I imitate in order to be original?
Yeah.
Or Dylan.
Yeah.
And Kerouac said, you know, it's not what you write, it's how you write it.
Yeah, if you just, I had a great English teacher, and who gave me this great. I never went to college, so which the Globe fortunately never found out. But
Now we know.
yeah, and now it doesn't matter.
Want to help you, Andy?
Yeah, but one of the things he preached, this English teacher, all year long, was not to worry about style. Just worry about clarity, and you'll have a style because everybody's unique. So don't try to be stylish. Don't try to find your own way of saying things. Just try to say it as simply and clearly as you can, and you will say it in a way that nobody's ever said it before, because you are yourself. You're unique.
The same thing, it applies to sing. I'm a singer, and when I'm studying, I study with a vocal coach. It's actually more interpretation than anything. And we talk about that all the time, about just sing from your own voice. You know, no matter how your voice sounds, don't, you know, and it's very difficult
Yeah.
as a singer, something audio, to not, you know, whose rendition of this are you doing?
Mhm.
You know, like when